Picture this. You walk into a grocery store with a briefcase full of cash, literally millions of dollars, just to buy a loaf of bread. And the cashier tells you it's not enough. This wasn't some dystopian movie scene. This was everyday life in Zimbabwe in 2008, where the government had printed so much money that a single US dollar was worth over 2 trillion Zimbabwean dollars. By the end of that year, Zimbabwe had issued a $100 trillion banknote that couldn't buy you a candy bar. It's a story so absurd it sounds fictional, yet it reveals profound truths about money, power, and what happens when governments abandon economic reality. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most spectacular currency collapses in human history, a cautionary tale that began with good intentions, but ended with an entire nation's money becoming literally worthless. This is the story of how Zimbabwe killed its own currency. To understand how Zimbabwe's economy imploded, we need to start at the beginning. When Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, it was actually considered one of Africa's most promising economies. The country had fertile land, abundant natural resources including gold and diamonds, and a relatively well-developed infrastructure left over from the colonial era. Robert Mugabe, the new president, inherited what was often called the breadbasket of Africa. Zimbabwe's agricultural sector was thriving, dominated by large-scale commercial farms that exported tobacco, corn, and beef throughout the region. The Zimbabwean dollar, introduced in 1980, was actually stronger than the US dollar in those early years. But beneath this prosperity lay a fundamental tension that would eventually destroy everything. The colonial government had concentrated the best agricultural land in the hands of white farmers, who made up less than 1% of the population but owned about 70% of the arable land. This was clearly unjust, and land redistribution was always part of Mugabe's agenda. The problem wasn't the goal, it was how Mugabe chose to achieve it. For the first 2 decades of independence, Zimbabwe's economy remained relatively stable. Land redistribution happened slowly, with the government purchasing farms from willing sellers and redistributing them to black farmers. But by the late 1990s, Mugabe's political position was weakening. A new opposition party was gaining support, and veterans of the Independence War were demanding faster action on land reform. In 2000, Mugabe made a fateful decision. Instead of continuing the gradual, legal process of land redistribution, he endorsed violent land seizures. Gangs of so-called war veterans, many too young to have actually fought in the independence struggle, began occupying white-owned farms. The government not only allowed this, but actively encouraged it. The results were catastrophic. Commercial farming, which had been the backbone of Zimbabwe's economy, collapsed almost overnight. These weren't just any farms being seized. They were some of the most productive agricultural operations in Africa, run by farmers with decades of experience and access to modern equipment and techniques. The new occupants, while having every right to own land, often lacked the technical knowledge, equipment, or capital needed to maintain production levels. Agricultural output plummeted. Zimbabwe went from being a food exporter to requiring food imports almost immediately. But here's where the story gets really interesting from an economic perspective. Faced with a collapsing economy, massive unemployment, and growing civil unrest, Mugabe's government had a choice. They could admit their mistakes, reverse course, and try to rebuild the economy. Or they could try to paper over the crisis by printing money. They chose to print. The logic seemed simple enough. The government needed money to pay civil servants, fund social programs, and maintain political support. Tax revenues were collapsing along with the economy, so borrowing was becoming difficult and expensive. The printing press offered what seemed like an easy solution. In 2000, Zimbabwe's inflation rate was about 55%, high, but not unprecedented. Many countries have dealt with similar levels of inflation, but what happened next was a masterclass in how economic problems can spiral completely out of control. When you print money to solve fiscal problems, you create inflation. When you respond to that inflation by printing even more money, you create hyperinflation. And once hyperinflation begins, it becomes incredibly difficult to stop because it creates its own vicious cycle. Here's how it works. When people realize their money is losing value rapidly, they try to spend it as quickly as possible. This increased velocity of money amplifies the inflationary effect of the increased money supply. Businesses, knowing that their costs will be higher tomorrow than today, raise prices preemptively. Workers demand higher wages to keep up with rising prices. The government, facing higher costs for everything from paper clips to salaries, prints even more money to meet its obligations. By 2001, Zimbabwe's inflation rate had reached 100%. Prices were doubling every year. But this was just the beginning. The government's response was predictable. They printed more money. They justified this by blaming the inflation on sanctions, droughts, and sabotage by Western powers and domestic enemies. While external factors certainly played a role, the primary driver was the exponential growth in money supply. By 2003, inflation had reached 600% annually. The Zimbabwean dollar, which had started stronger than the US dollar, now required about 800 Zimbabwe dollars to buy one US dollar. But even this exchange rate was largely theoretical because foreign currency was becoming increasingly scarce. As the crisis deepened, ordinary Zimbabweans developed increasingly creative survival strategies. Those who could access foreign currency, through relatives abroad, black market trading, or connections to the tourism industry, hoarded it desperately. US dollars, British pounds, and South African rand became unofficial parallel currencies. Barter systems emerged spontaneously. People traded goods directly. A mechanic might fix a car in exchange for groceries. A teacher might tutor children in return for firewood. Some communities even returned to using gold dust and silver coins as mediums of exchange, essentially reverting to monetary systems that hadn't been seen for centuries. But for many people, especially those on fixed incomes like pensioners and government workers, there was no escape. Their life savings evaporated. Pensions that had been accumulated over decades of work became worthless in a matter of months. The psychological impact was devastating. Money is more than just a medium of exchange. It represents security, planning for the future, the ability to save and invest. When money becomes worthless, it destroys people's ability to think beyond immediate survival. By 2006, Zimbabwe's annual inflation rate exceeded 1,000%. The government was now printing new denominations regularly. The highest denomination note went from 20 Zimbabwe dollars in the 1980s to 100,000 Zimbabwe dollars. But this was still nothing compared to what was coming. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, under Governor Gideon Gono, began implementing increasingly desperate measures. They tried price controls, which simply created shortages as businesses couldn't afford to sell goods below cost. They tried currency reforms, lopping zeros off the currency in an attempt to make the numbers more manageable. In August 2006, Zimbabwe removed 3 zeros from its currency. 1,000 old Zimbabwe dollars became one new Zimbabwe dollar. The government claimed this would help restore confidence in the currency. Instead, it was like putting a Band-Aid on a severed artery. The fundamental problem remained. The government was still printing massive amounts of money to finance its operations. The currency reform didn't address the underlying fiscal crisis, so inflation continued to accelerate. By 2007, the situation had moved beyond crisis into the realm of the surreal. Annual inflation reached 66,000%. Prices were doubling every month. The government was printing $500,000 and $1 million notes, and these were becoming insufficient for basic transactions within weeks. Ordinary transactions became exercises in absurdity. People carried money in wheelbarrows, suitcases, and shopping bags. Banks imposed withdrawal limits not because of liquidity concerns, but because physically counting and transporting the required banknotes was becoming impractical. The human stories from this period are heartbreaking. Teachers couldn't afford to get to work because their monthly salary wouldn't cover a week's bus fare. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies because their budgets, set at the beginning of the month, were worth a fraction of their value by month's end. Parents sent children to school with bags of cash to buy lunch, only to find that prices had doubled since breakfast. But perhaps most tragically, people's fundamental relationship with money and planning for the future was destroyed. Why save for tomorrow when your savings would be worth half as much next week? Why sign a contract or make an investment when you couldn't predict what anything would cost next month? Then came 2008, the year Zimbabwe's hyperinflation achieved truly historic proportions. By January, annual inflation had reached 100,000%. By June, it was over 11 million%. And by November, it peaked at an incomprehensible 89.7 sextillion% annually. To put this in perspective, that's an 89 followed by 21 zeros. At the peak of hyperinflation, prices were doubling every single day. Something that cost 1 Zimbabwe dollar on Monday would cost 128 Zimbabwe dollars the following Monday. The government responded by printing larger and larger denominations. First came the $10 million and $50 million notes, then $100 million and $500 million. By the end of 2008, Zimbabwe had issued a $100 trillion banknote, a piece of paper that represented more money than most countries' entire GDP, but couldn't buy a loaf of bread in Harare. The $100 trillion note became a symbol of the entire crisis, a monument to the complete breakdown of monetary policy and economic rationality. Tourists began buying them as souvenirs, which was perhaps the most economically productive use they could be put to. But even as Zimbabwe was setting world records for inflation, the government continued to deny reality. Officials blamed the crisis on everything except their own policies. Western sanctions, drought, business sabotage, speculators, and opposition politicians were all cited as causes of the hyperinflation. Governor Gono of the Reserve Bank became almost a caricature of denial, making statements that would have been comedic if they weren't so tragic. He argued that printing money was actually fighting inflation by ensuring adequate liquidity. He compared himself to central bankers in the United States and Europe, claiming they were also printing money to address economic crises. While there was a grain of truth in some of these claims, other central banks were indeed expanding money supplies in response to the 2008 global financial crisis. The scale was completely different. The Federal Reserve's quantitative easing increased the U.S. money supply by tens of percentage points. Zimbabwe was increasing its money supply by tens of thousands of percentage points. The comparison revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of monetary economics. When a credible central bank with a strong currency prints money during a crisis, it can stimulate economic activity. When a central bank that has already destroyed its credibility prints money, it only accelerates the destruction of the currency. By early 2009, the Zimbabwean dollar had effectively ceased to function as money. Even the government began accepting tax payments in foreign currencies. Schools, hospitals, and businesses operated on a mixture of US dollars, South African rand, and barter arrangements. In April 2009, the government officially suspended the Zimbabwe dollar and allowed the use of foreign currencies for all transactions. It was an admission that they had completely destroyed their own monetary system. A currency that had once been stronger than the US dollar simply ceased to exist. The human cost of this monetary collapse was enormous. GDP contracted by more than 40% between 2000 and 2009. Unemployment reached over 90%. Millions of Zimbabweans fled to neighboring countries as economic refugees. Life expectancy plummeted as the healthcare system collapsed and malnutrition became widespread. But Zimbabwe's hyperinflation also provides crucial lessons about the nature of money and the importance of sound monetary policy. It demonstrates how quickly confidence in a currency can evaporate once people lose faith in the authorities who issue it. Money, at its core, is based on trust. We accept paper currency not because it has intrinsic value, but because we trust that others will accept it tomorrow. When that trust is broken, money becomes just paper, and an economy can regress centuries in terms of its monetary sophistication. Zimbabwe's experience also illustrates the political economy of hyperinflation. Governments don't usually choose hyperinflation. they stumble into it through a series of decisions that seem rational in the short term, but are catastrophic in the long term. Faced with immediate political pressures, leaders often choose the temporary relief of printing money over the painful but necessary structural reforms that would actually solve their fiscal problems. The parallels with other hyperinflation episodes throughout history are striking. Weimar Germany in the 1920s, Hungary after World War II, Yugoslavia in the 1990s, all followed similar patterns. Economic crisis leads to fiscal crisis, governments turn to the printing press, hyperinflation destroys the currency, and ultimately, the government is forced to abandon its own money. What makes Zimbabwe's case particularly interesting is how it played out in the modern era, with digital banking, global communications, and sophisticated financial markets. Even with all these modern tools, the fundamental economic forces proved unstoppable once they were unleashed. The recovery also offers lessons. Once Zimbabwe abandoned its own currency and adopted the US dollar, inflation immediately stopped. Economic activity began to recover. The change was so dramatic, it was almost like a light switch being flipped. This demonstrated that the hyperinflation was indeed a monetary phenomenon, not the result of sanctions or droughts as the government had claimed. However, using a foreign currency also meant giving up monetary sovereignty. Zimbabwe couldn't print US dollars to respond to economic shocks. They couldn't devalue their currency to boost exports. They had to live within their means because they couldn't create money out of thin air. For many Zimbabweans, this trade-off was absolutely worth it. Stable money, even if it meant less policy flexibility, was infinitely preferable to hyperinflation. People could plan for the future again. They could save money without watching it evaporate. Businesses could sign contracts and make investments. But the scars of hyperinflation lasted much longer than the hyperinflation itself. An entire generation of Zimbabweans had learned not to trust paper money, not to save for the future, not to believe government economic statistics. These psychological impacts can persist for decades. Even today, more than a decade later, Zimbabwe struggles with the legacy of its monetary collapse. Multiple attempts to reintroduce a local currency have failed because people simply don't trust the government with monetary policy. The memory of the $100 trillion note serves as a permanent reminder of what can happen when monetary discipline is abandoned. The story of Zimbabwe's hyperinflation is ultimately a story about the limits of political power over economic reality. A government can pass laws, control the military, and dominate the media, but it cannot repeal the laws of economics. When politicians try to create wealth by printing money, they discover that they can create inflation, but they cannot create prosperity. The $100 trillion note sits today in museums and private collections around the world, a testament to one of the most spectacular monetary failures in human history. It serves as a reminder that sound money isn't just an abstract economic concept, but a foundation of civilized society. For those of us living in countries with stable currencies, it's easy to take money for granted. We assume that the numbers in our bank accounts will mean roughly the same thing tomorrow as they do today. Zimbabwe's experience shows us how precious and fragile this assumption really is. The lesson isn't just for governments and central bankers, though they certainly need to remember that monetary credibility, once lost, is incredibly difficult to regain. The lesson is for all of us to understand that the money we use every day represents a form of social contract, a shared agreement about value and trust that forms the foundation of economic life. Zimbabwe's $100 trillion note is more than just a curiosity or a collector's item. It's a warning from recent history about what happens when that social contract breaks down. In our current era of unprecedented monetary expansion by central banks around the world, Zimbabwe's story reminds us that there are always limits to how far you can stretch the definition of money before it snaps back with devastating consequences. The people of Zimbabwe paid an enormous price for their government's monetary recklessness. Their sacrifice should serve as a permanent reminder that sound money isn't just good economics. It's a moral imperative that protects the savings, dreams, and futures of ordinary people who have no choice but to trust the money their government provides.